Good evening and a very warm welcome to this edition of Public Forum. I'm Shalini Verma. In this edition of Public Forum, we discuss the outcome of the 4th BRICS Summit, the increasing significance of the grouping in the global economy, and the challenges that lies ahead. And my guests today are Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He's a professor and dean with the Jindal School of International Affairs. Dr. R.N. Das, senior fellow with the Institute of Defence Studies and Analysis, and Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, Senior Fellow with Research and Information System for Developing Countries. But before we start the discussion, let us first take a look at this report. Right, so South Africa is the new member here in the BRIC group, and of course this group has gained clout over the past decade as their economies grew faster than the rest of the world. Let's start with you, Dr. Chaulia. We heard as to what all came out of this summit. How do you look at the outcome of the 4th BRIC Summit?
I think it's a successful event beyond doubt. There were lots of skeptics, especially in the West, who thought that this was just a showmanship and that it was just hot air. But I think in terms of substantive outcomes, it was like a workman-like summit, minus any kind of frills and showbiz. I think they achieved quite a lot in concrete terms of these institutional new developments. And I think it also shows a level of maturation of this whole project of emerging economies. And they can come together and forge joint positions on global economic and political issues. So I think overall it sends out a message that this grouping, which will probably expand with a few more emerging economies joining it in due time because of the natural process of economic growth. I think this grouping is sending a message that we are serious and we are forging a common front, and that we are working towards this multipolar world, and that we need to be taken more seriously for being this large, for all the statistical reasons you just mentioned, and that also it's not just statistics but common policies. And that is really the outcome of this summit.
That's right. Dr. Chaulia, would you agree that now the countries, especially the nations, the big powers among the BRICS group of nations, they are realizing the responsibility that they have upon themselves about first sorting out the political kind of problems that they share, and then moving ahead with certain other issues too, because trade and economic ties have been a great, they have really helped in strengthening the ties.
Yeah, it's one of the unspoken benefits of multilateralism that bilateral tiffs do get massaged, not resolved, because bilateral problems have their own dynamic. But what these kind of groupings do is that they give you a sense of a larger purpose rather than petty disputes. But of course, on a separate track, the problems continue. But what happens is that at this level, you're thinking about what can you do collectively on the world stage? What is your relationship or equation vis-a-vis Europe and the OECD countries and the United States?
Which,
as Dr. Chaturvedi said,
you're saying that on the sidelines of such summits, if two nations meet and if their heads of state meet and they discuss certain very deep political issues too, well, it certainly helps.
The atmospherics is one of a joint front of the global south, right? So you would want to at least keep aside the more cumbersome bilateral problems and think about, what is the grand strategy here. And I think that's where, for example, Iran and Syria, the comments of the BRICS leaders at the end are quite significant, because there they are not talking about the border dispute or about, one-upmanship.
Yeah.
So it's a totally different, game plan at a multilateral forum.
Okay, Dr. Chaulia, let's start with this. We heard the Prime Minister making a speech in the BRICS Summit, and very categorically he said that I'm going to emphasize on 10 different essential points here. And his essential points included creation of 8 to 10 million jobs every year over the decade to absorb the expected growth in labor force. He talked about availability of energy and food for countries that account for more than 40% of the world population. He talked about promoting sustained and balanced global economic growth. He talked about green growth, about issues like water and sanitation, water supply, and things like waste management, stormwater drainage, urban planning, urban transport. What does it really say about the developing countries, and that to India, let's say, as a leader of those developing countries, emphasizing on such pertinent issues?
Well, BRICS has to assume responsibility of being, let's say, the avant-garde of the global south now, because they have the higher growths compared to the least so-called LDCs, the least developed countries. So I think, of course, they also have their own internal public policy problems, some of which are covered by these points of the Prime Minister. I think aspirationally, all the countries will, of course, pay lip service to resolving these problems jointly. But what would be great is if there is greater technical and knowledge transfer on specific problem solving related to these nitty-gritty questions of development, and both within BRICS and then beyond it and spreading to the rest of the global south. It has been happening on a small scale, but what economic growth does is it creates hubs of scientific knowledge and R&D and technology in some of these upwardly mobile countries of the global south, like the BRICS. And now it is really their historic responsibility, because the LDCs have been watching them for a long time, and there have been points where the LDCs have felt betrayed by these upwardly mobile countries, that they have one foot in the great power camp and one foot they're still talking about, G77 and the ideals of the non-aligned movement. So they need to reconcile this. They need to show leadership, especially on the developmental agenda. And at the end of the day, be it the BRICS Bank or be it these technical cooperation projects, this is how BRICS will raise their value as an alternative to the Bretton Woods system and to the former European and North American neo-colonial approaches towards developmental questions. If BRICS has to forge something drastically different, it will have to come up with solutions on all this. So I'm happy that it's on the agenda, but it will be better if we come up with concrete projects that elucidate how South-South cooperation through knowledge sharing, technology transfer can
help these nations, and in turn also help the other nations, the least developed countries, as you say, who will be looking at the BRICS nation.
Because at the end of the day, if BRICS are bargaining for themselves to get a seat at the high table and to become more important, and they leave behind the rest of the LDCs, it splits the global south right down the middle and creates camps. And we have gone through that very, very painful phase when there was a Chinese-led group and an Indian-led group and all that. We have to overcome those and to forge about infrastructure. I was recently in Africa where Chinese infrastructure projects are massive. They've just swamped everybody else, which is not necessarily a negative thing, but it has some controversial aspects to it. What's interesting is that I think the Chinese will realize in time that as a single country which goes around with checkbook with its massive foreign exchange reserves, it is increasingly drawing negative reactions in some parts of Africa and Latin America. If the BRICS Bank, with a seed capital of its own, goes and then supports infrastructure growth in the rest of the global south, politically it will be far more acceptable. Because there's Brazil there's India. It cannot be seen as as the West. Some people in the West portray as a Chinese neo-colonialism in Africa and Latin America. So I think China obviously has the largest reserves, world's highest, and will probably support the seed capital of the bank with the highest contribution. Even as a percentage of GDP, it's a $7 trillion economy, while the rest of the BRICS are nowhere close. So Chinese capital, through the vehicle of BRICS, with governors and decision makers of all the other BRICS countries together, they can really spur infrastructure growth in the global south, and it will be less controversial. And I believe, as I said before, creating some kind of an alternative structure to the infrastructure financing that has come out of the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank and the IMF model. So I think this is where BRICS really have potential. And this bank, I think, as it reaches the launch, we will see a greater cohesion in thinking about where to fund infrastructure projects, both within BRICS and then beyond it.
Yeah, and we also heard Dr. Chaulia, I understand you have to say something on the BRICS Development Bank. You wanted to say something.
Yes, the sentiment at the grassroots, irrespective of what the Prime Minister holds, he holds the Bretton Woods institutions in some favorable light, and he believes in a so-called supplementary approach rather than replacing them altogether. If you see the sentiment on the ground, go to Africa, Latin America, the overwhelming chorus is saying that Bretton Woods has failed. We need something radically and drastically different. That's why we have the Bank of the South under the ALBA initiative in Latin America. It's small, but it's grown. It has legitimacy. So BRICS has to provide something legitimate and something alternative in the long run. They will make halting steps and baby steps at the moment. At the present juncture, where you are entering into multipolarity, it is risky to openly say that we are creating something, to oppose the World Bank and the IMF. So therefore, this whole talk at the summit that this is going to complement the Bretton Woods institutions. But in the long run, as power transfers, you are talking about more self-confidence in the global south, and where we will talk about creating a radically different vision. I think we should dream big and we should aspire big.
But is it really good to expect that sort of cooperation and a very realistic view? What would you like to say about that when it comes to seeking that cooperation from China on different fronts, whether it is to do with India's role or India's increased position in the UNSC or other forums?
Well, for starters, I think I've said before that if it will be a huge confidence boosting measure if China unequivocally comes out and supports India's candidature for the permanent membership in the Security Council. It's not done that, and that remains one of the issues. So it's fine for BRICS to say that we want reform of the UN, but then there are differences, and therefore I think those watching the West. I mean, I was quoted in the New York Times recently, and if you saw the newspaper, the article itself was about it's all a lot of talk, and actually they are very disunited. So I think they will
I would like to take an opinion from you. Is it that the competition between India and China, is there a competition first? Second, of course, we know that there is some, but how is it really seen by the West? I mean, when we see India and China together on forums like basic groups or like
trade and so on, if you look at BRICS, I think this is the big rupture which has not been healed, because all the other states, Russia and China, have resolved most of the border disputes. In fact, they're almost united often in opposing Western interventions in many parts of the world. Brazil, South Africa, they're not contiguous, right? Where you have large, contiguous territories, there you have, the possibility of tension. But Russia and China have already resolved it, because they seem to have believed that unless they resolve it, the differences will be exploited by the West and so on. But we don't have that level of coordination yet.
Dr. Das, they were together.
Unlike Russia and China, that explicitly set out to maintain a balance of power in the Middle East and to counter Western hegemony, India doesn't explicitly do that. And I think they want to keep their doors open. This whole non-alignment 2.0 is basically this, which has been discussed recently, is all about being somewhere in the middle and to opportunistically align with one or the other based on issues on an ad hoc basis. So I think that's a big difference on Iran. India is doing it mainly not because it wants to keep the balance of power in the Middle East between the moderate and the radical states, Iran being the head of the radical states and anti-Western. Rather, it is for energy security, those kind of things. Russia and China is far more political in their approach to the Middle East and Iran. We are not yet there, but hopefully, through the BRICS mechanism, we'll also see reason in the Russian and Chinese position.
Okay, that's a very clear-cut assessment of what are the stakes of these countries that seem to be together, at least on these issues. Time here to take a very short break in public forum.
The basic objective is to have stability, peace and stability in Afghanistan.
Okay, but there are other challenges also here, Dr. Chaulia, whether it's the issue of poverty, population, governance, foreign exchange, trade, and of course, not to forget, clean green growth. Now that is something which is very difficult, one would say, for the developing economies to achieve, since they have to ensure that the carbon emissions are up to that mark that the West imposes on them. How do you look at this particular phenomenon?
Yeah, all BRICS states, I'm sad to say, are capital offenders when it comes to the environment. Of course, because we have been arguing that, we have a right to develop, but do we have a right to pollute? Frankly speaking, I think we need to show more responsibility on this. And the other issue is China, interestingly, has invested a lot in green technologies, but mostly for export, not for changing the way its manufacturing basis is conducted, which is still primarily coal. But these solar panels and the wind turbines that they're manufacturing are much cheaper.
But these nations now need technology finance transfer from the developed economies.
Absolutely. There are cases against China and the WTO by the Europeans and the Americans on subsidizing solar panels and wind turbines. I have always argued that in the interest of a greener planet, these things should be exempted from this whole dispute mechanism in the WTO, because the West may be losing some business, but the point is, if you're getting cheaper solar panels from China, why not accept them? The only fear is of monopoly, right?
Okay.
But we are not going that far. So I think green technology, there is definitely a case for BRICS to make a stand on it and to adopt it internally first, and then of course to also use it as a medium for export.
Dr. Chaturvedi,